Marc, let me start by saying a big thank you for joining us for the first episode of The Responsible Edge in 2025. Can't quite believe we've made it to a quarter of a century, but really appreciate you giving up your time this January morning.
Yeah, no problem. It's good to be on. Looking forward to the chat, really.
Top man. So, Marc, I think your background again is fascinating in terms of the sort of the timeline of events and things that you've done throughout your career, and perhaps different to some of the other guests that we've had on the show before. Start wherever you would like to. I mean, as I think I mentioned to you before, we have our guests who like go back to the very beginning, if you like. But perhaps just introduce our listeners to you and your background, and specifically perhaps just highlight the role that kind of corporate ethics, responsibility, sustainability has played in your decision making throughout your career.
Yeah. I mean, I've got a sort of varied path, I guess. I started out as an engineer. My background's an engineer, engineering university. Did that for several years at a telecoms company, bizarrely. But got a bit fed up of sitting in cold switch rooms in warm cities. Just one day went out and did another master's in sustainable building design. And then I sort of went into a career of engineering for the next probably 10, 15 years, doing engineering consultancy in the construction sector. And then really luckily happened to sort of take that knowledge forward and take it into the role I'm in now, which is at an architectural practice, Maccreanor Lavington, which is a sort of Sterling award-winning practice. And, I lead up sustainability for them, which has been super interesting, really, and an unbelievably varied role. I'm sort of responsible for what the practice is doing, how we're doing on our net zero journey, but then our projects, training people, all that kind of stuff, really. So yeah, it's probably quite different as well. I'm an engineer sitting in an architect, which is for me has been amazing to sort of understand, learn what they're doing, how they work, and get in there right from the beginning, really, right from the concept stages, and sort of try and influence what's happening, really.
Marc, I love it. And that was, by the way, that was an absolutely sensationally concise synopsis of your background and career. But I'm not going to let you get away that easily without us diving into some of it. Let's take you back to you mentioned your higher education, university. Give us a sense. Like, was that a degree? When you say engineering, anything in particular, or any?
Yeah. So I did electronic engineering, really. So almost completely different. Electronic and telecoms, and so I went and worked for a telecoms company for about 5 years, which was okay, was good, but wasn't really. I think I kind of always knew I wanted to do something a bit different. I think I remember a conversation in the kitchen with some of my friends once saying, what I'd really like to do is sort of look at buildings and how they work and how they can be more energy efficient, etc. And I don't really know how I came across it, but I came across an MSc at De Montfort University, which was absolutely amazing, just really practical in terms of the teaching. I think, when you do an undergraduate, it's quite theoretical, and you don't really use that much of what you're doing. Whereas this was a lot more practical in terms of how buildings sort of work and all that kind of stuff, really.
And Marc, let me ask you. I want to get some of the human experience of that, because when you mentioned this conversation that you had with friends, where you acknowledged that you were more interested in buildings and how they're built to ensure efficiencies, etc. Like, was that whilst you were at university doing your undergrad, or was that when you had left and you were now?
I think that was after I'd left. I think. Okay. I think when you get your first job, you don't really know what you're going into, what you're going to be doing, do you? Really? Yeah. And it was good, but it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And luckily, I was sort of brave enough to make this decision to leave and go back to studying and start learning about this stuff, really. I think I've probably helped that I've got a inquisitive mind, which is probably something that we've talked about. I sort of go down these rabbit warrens of research, or what if that's what you want to call it, I don't know. It just took me down this path of buildings, and it's been great.
And Mark, and I'm gonna put some numbers to you and tell me if I've got them like wildly wrong. But you're what, 20? You've been working. You finished your undergrad what, 21, 22, and then went and worked for 5 years. So you're 27, 28
when I changed. Sorry,
when you're 27, 28 when you decided to go back into
probably around that age. Yeah.
And you mentioned courage, the courage to do it. Like, what was that? I mean, because I presume, you work 5 years, you're building your career in one area. Like it is a courageous act to go, I can imagine, things are going well, there's a possibility of growth and development within the role in the kind of traditional metrics of what a successful career looks like. And you just stopped yourself and said, no, this isn't what's burning my fire, if you like, and I need to change. Like, just talk us through that human experience for you of going, no, I need to fix this.
I think, I've actually done it twice, because it's with my new role. It's also quite a big change in some respects.
Mm-hmm.
I think the first time was much easier. I was a young person, renting, all that kind of stuff. The ability to move around is easier.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one I sort of more, I don't know, I think almost fell into it, if that makes sense. I kind of just went through the process so quickly before I knew I was doing it. And it was like, oh, this is quite good. I quite enjoy this. So, I think that was probably quite easier. But I think as I transitioned from an engineering role into an architectural practice, with a family and everything, that's been much more, well, I mean, it's been great and fulfilling, but it was definitely a much braver decision, I think. I guess I could have stayed in that role and worked my way, like you say, up to this, technical manager, blah, blah, blah. And, probably been earning a lot more money than I'm doing right now. But I'm kind of glad I didn't really do that, and I guess, you always look at you look back at the people you worked with and you see what they're doing, and you get a little bit of like, oh, okay, that's quite nice. But then you sort of think, well, actually, what am I doing in my job now? Like, hopefully I'm bringing a lot more value. Maybe I'm not, I don't know, who knows, but, hopefully what I'm doing now is, trying to do a little bit better and a bit more than than what we were, just working in a very sort of capitalistic model of, working your way up and getting more and more salary, really. So,
Mark, it's a fascinating point. We've had conversations recently with guests, like when we've talked about this whole, I guess, sort of Gen Z inspired like notion of impact when it comes to, our professional careers and what we do. And I think what's lost sometimes is the fact that impact can mean such different things to different people. And what you got to do is have the courage, as you've alluded to check in with yourself as to, well, what does that look like for me? Like, I'm not going to just take a scripted version of what impact or what outcome of my career needs to look like. I'm going to actually search in myself and find whatever that direction is that I want to take. But anyway, I'm not going to go on to a careers advice here from me, because I definitely not want to throw that around. Mark, let me ask you. So let's just go. So you're doing this, and I know you mentioned that you go back and into education further on down your line, but let's just go through chronologically. You're then back at university. You're doing this degree that's you're now learning about buildings. Was it a degree that specifically looked at the sustainability and energy efficiency, as you alluded to, or did that come later?
No, it was specifically around sustainability. So it was all about, I mean, at that time in the industry, it was about energy efficiency. The industry's kind of moved on to thinking about a lot more factors that we should really be thinking about. But yeah, it was a very sort of technical. Well, actually, that's not true. It was technical in some respects. A lot of sort of energy modeling and things like that. But actually, probably the bit that's grown me the most is maybe the sort of policy side, the softer side. So that was kind of when, I mean, the UN had been out for a while, but there was a lot of research into things like the UN sustainability goals and things like that. And I think that was when I started to sort of formulate what I thought about the world, if that makes sense, and where my values started to come out in terms of how I would approach sustainability, or and what I think is the better thing to be doing, and what to avoid. I think that was, and I remember one thing where one of my university professors actually, and I think this influenced me a lot, which was the first article I wrote, which, coming from a technical background, I'm having to sort of write a piece of prose and stuff, which is a bit different. And he was like, oh, this is very journalistic. And he was like, what you actually need to do is step back, and you need to be more critical in your thinking. And it was very interesting what he, and it made me definitely realize that, that first thing, you were kind of trying to write things to sort of maybe not please people, but almost like, maybe just being a bit too kind, and not kind, but, maybe not being honest enough about what.
Fitting the narrative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Rather than maybe, thinking a bit more about and delving a bit deeper into, trying to understand what's really going on. So, yeah.
And what and so let's like skip forward. So you then completed that, and it's a master's that you've done. So you've done the master's, and then what's the role that you then take on after that sort of second piece of higher education?
So I guess, didn't really know what I could do with that afterwards in some respects. But happened to sort of come across a role at a small, what we call building services consultancy, which in some respects was the best thing that could have happened, really, because I went there, there were probably 4 or 5 people working in this consultancy, and I was the kind of workload, So I basically, so I ended up doing a lot of energy modeling, which I obviously was interested in. But I then started doing a lot of engineering around building services. So that's things like the mechanical systems, the ventilation systems. And I started to, I was basically doing everything within that project. So the engineering design, the energy modeling, so, the reporting. And I think what that gave me is it gave me a very quick, fast, rounded development, which I think was exceptionally useful. If I had gone into a much larger consultancy, I would have probably got pigeonholed a bit, which is what happens to a lot of people. And so you might have someone that is doing sustainability and energy, but hasn't stepped foot on a building site, for example, and that makes it really difficult, I think, for them to sort of do their role. So I was quite lucky. I was doing site visits, going around building sites, understanding how things are being built, and then doing the sort of modeling design behind that, really. So that, I think that was really useful in terms of accelerating, having changed career, to be able to accelerate me to like a much higher level very quickly was really good, actually.
And ultimately, and you described it perfectly, but just for my own benefit, it's the fact that you were able to expose yourself, if you like, to all of the different influences across the whole sort of holistic spectrum of what goes on in terms of a construction project, which enabled you ultimately to have a really strong foundation that sort of aided you specifically. You mentioned, we're going to come on to talk about the role that you're in at the moment, but that's a multifaceted, holistic role, and perhaps gave you some of that kind of initial standing, if you like, that was going to help you in the later part of your career.
Yeah, and I think I understand how the different sort of roles and areas are sort of linked. I think that's quite important. I don't, your listeners, not sure how many would know the construction industry as such, but what you kind of get with these siloed roles is that you might get someone write a sustainability report and an energy report, and they'll put in a set of performance requirements around the building. So, how well the windows need to perform or the ventilation system. But if you've never actually designed that, you might be writing in something in there that's completely unachievable, or, so for example, in a piece of ventilation equipment, you might put in such a high efficiency, this piece of equipment becomes huge, and it wouldn't even fit in the building. And, so you can become quite disconnected in some respects. And, I think that is shown in some policy documents, actually, that have been written is, they're not really, they've been written by people who are sort of working in there a little bit, and they're obviously done for the great benefit, and they're trying to provide great guidance to the industry. But because they are a bit disconnected, they kind of fight each other almost, which doesn't really help you actually, do what you want to do in the end.
And I think, well, that's so brilliant. It kind of gives us a bit of a precursor to the article that we're going to talk about today, which sort of talks about that interdisciplinary sort of collaborative approach to resolving some of these issues, and the need for, I think, empathy is used quite a bit in the article. That understanding and appreciation of different points of view and different perspectives on coming up with solutions is absolutely crucial. So I think you've almost teased, if you like, what we're going to touch upon when we go there. But let's go back to you and where we are in your career. So you've joined this smaller consultancy, which has given you the opportunity to have this really solid sort of, well, it must have been, but I again come back to the point of courage. It must have been full on for you to go from, obviously a completely different, industry and career, going into, yes, a piece of higher education that sort of set the foundations and inspired you to, yes, this is exactly what I want to do. But then you're sort of thrown in the deep end at a small consultancy covering, all aspects of the building services that you've described. What happens next?
So worked there for a number of years, and then thought, okay, need to think about what the next steps is. So I then did move to a bigger consultancy. But I think, by that time I was fortunate that I had quite a good background behind me. So I did work at one of the sort of bigger consultancies in the industry for about 5 years. And it probably was, again, a lucky good step. Ended up working on some, huge projects in the City of London that, again, sort of just took me to sort of increase my knowledge, and, was working on some exceptionally big construction sites, which I hadn't been doing before. In a smaller consultancy, you tend to be doing smaller projects, maybe extensions, slightly bigger projects, etc. Went to there for 5 years, was sort of leading teams within project teams within that role, managing a whole variety of disciplines underneath me.
Sorry to interrupt you, but what was that like for you? Was that your first experience of sort of management of people, or had you done that sort of previously?
I think I'd done a bit of it previously, I think, maybe not as a sort of official, but I'd had junior members that I'd worked with before and things. But I think, this was probably the first time that I had been, I was leading quite large projects and, being the sort of main point of contact, that the client would call you up and potentially have a nice chat with you, or potentially not a nice chat with you. So that was difficult, I think. I think that was, I think that's the thing that makes these projects difficult is the relationships and people, as the article kind of suggests, really. I think it's different people's opinions, different working styles. That's quite tricky to get everyone working in the same direction, I think. And in the construction industry, that's not always about sustainability. A lot of it is about cost, time, efficiency, and that's probably why I looked to move at some point, was also because in that role you've only got so much influence in some respects. You might want to be thinking about what's better for the environment or whatnot, but and there might be, and there's obviously some other people around you, but ultimately you're sort of still in this big machine, which is people trying to get projects built quickly, and as and as cheaply as possible.
And Mark, I was going to ask you a question earlier, about how you mentioned how your view of the world, your values, if you like, they really kind of appeared and solidified, if you like, during that, when you went back to university for the first time and you really grounded in that. You've not really touched upon this, but you've just alluded to it there, though, in terms of like the decision that you made next to move on from the larger consultancy. Like, what does it mean to you to work on sustainability, environmental sustainability focused work? Or, I know that Roll now broadly looks at all aspects of sustainability, but like, what does this stuff mean to you? Like, when did it really become, really significant and important to you?
I think when I was younger, I probably had quite a high value system, I think. I don't really know what created that as such. I sort of look back on that quite a lot, but I've probably been always someone who's tended to try and follow the rules in some respects and whatnot. But I think it was probably at university when the second time where I had taught, you have this, that's the thing about university, you have the time to read and research. That's probably the bit that's most undervalued about going and studying, really, is you have this time to just read. And I think when I started to take in a lot of this information that was out there around what was happening in the world, you do think, yeah, gosh, it's a bit of an unfair place, isn't it? And you start to, I certainly felt like how fortunate I am, and how I've been brought up, how my parents provided for me, where I've lived, all those kind of things. And I don't think, I think I realized that, we do have to probably live slightly differently in our world in that respect. We have in the Western world, we have taken it for granted, really. But I think, it was during that period of being able to take in this amount of information and sort of start deciding for yourself, like, what do you think is the right?
It's Mark, it's fascinating because there's something around. I've spoken to a lot of people. I've spoken to a number of people that have spoken about going back to higher education at that kind of stage of the kind of late 20s, early 30s, that around that kind of time. And to me, I reflect upon, being an undergraduate and, being fairly idealistic, but also perhaps not really understanding, the world ahead of me, and the sort of formation of my worldview, if you like, and how beneficial it is for people to perhaps go back with a little bit of more life experience, but to be given the condition that you've just described, which is the time to read and immerse and reflect and kind of set the agenda, if you like, in your own mind as to how you're going to approach the rest of your professional career, but your personal life. Like, what are the things that matter to you? It's a perhaps sometimes it's an unrecognized benefit to going back to higher education at that stage, is that opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. I think it definitely allowed me to, think about where I want to go and what I mean. I mean, but I think, you're right. I think in the world, the sort of real world experience, I mean, it's difficult in the sort of sustainability world because you've got a group of people who are kind of, we're doing okay. We need, especially in the UK, we think we're doing quite well, and we should just keep doing what we're doing, and the sort of pragmatic side, and then you've got the other side, which is a much more sort of radical side in some respects, that believes that we need, much more system change in the way that we work and things. And I think I've just sort of weirdly fallen in the middle in some respects. Because I think, it needs a bit of both. And, unfortunately, like, I would love the world to change tomorrow, but do I think that can happen the way that quickly? I wish it could. But we've got to bring people along on the journey, really. And I think that's the thing that is maybe sort of sometimes we forget that in some respects. And, but going back to you saying about what your own views are, there are everyone's got their own view, haven't they? And I think sometimes in our little bubbles, we feel like everyone's got the same view as us, and they don't actually. And that's difficult because, like, you think, well, why wouldn't you care? And that's actually the same in the article, which you've shown me, is actually generally people do care. It's just that maybe something else in their life is making them make a different decision. But I think, you've got to have a bit of both in terms of what, how you go about your work. I want, part of it is to sort of inspire and whatnot, and provide a positive outlook and sort of try and get that, people to think about if the way they've done things is the right way to keep doing them. But we've also got to get people moving along, and you've got a lot of people to convince, unfortunately. I mean, I think this is probably quite, maybe a bit harsh to say in some respects, but I think, in the sustainability world, I think everyone cares. And I think people do care, but I think there's also a lot of people who are, struggling in their lives for whatever reason, or they're making different decisions. And, there's a lot of people out there that don't want to cycle to work or whatever, for whatever reason, even if it's the best thing for them, even for them or for the world in some respects. So, yeah.
It's a brilliant sort of characterization, I think, of the issues at play, Mark. I think you've you've nailed that in a really accessible way. The way that you just described things, I couldn't agree with you more. I think we need to be, for me, I know this might even be an oxymoron, but it's almost we need to be realistically optimistic about how things can change, and we need to be. And we keep alluding to the article, which we will now talk about, but we need to have a degree of empathy and understanding of different perspectives and different views and different kind of challenges that individuals are going through. And I think that will create a much more sympathetic dialogue that will lead to progress, as opposed to mud being thrown from various different sides, which I think can be applied, in all honesty, to all forms of public discourse, not just environmental sustainability. But that's for another podcast, Mark. We'll have to get you on to cover that in a bit more detail. I know we haven't touched upon your last stage of your career, but we can certainly talk about it perhaps at the end of this next section. We've obliterated our first 20 minutes to talk about you, which is kind of understandable. But Mark, perhaps you wouldn't mind just now providing a summary for our listeners of the article in I think it was the Centre for Sustainability Development Studies at the University of Amsterdam. Would you provide just a bit of a summary for our listeners, and then pick out for you whatever the most kind of interesting salient points were?
Yeah, so I think the article was super interesting and quite close to some other stuff I've been looking at, really. But yeah, it's really about behavioural change. And how, if we actually look at how we solve the issue of sustainability, that actually a lot of it is going to come down to behavior change. And, the article maybe didn't allude to this, but, we kind of know we've got the technological solutions right now to be able to solve lots of these problems. And actually a lot of it comes down to, people and their behaviors, really. And, I think what the article is alluding to is, things like, you can design electric cars, for example, but how do you get people to actually transition to using them? Or the common one in the UK is heat pumps. How do we get people to transition to heat pumps? The technology is there, but people, for whatever reason, don't really want to do it. And I think what they've started to look at is, how we can sort of use behavioral science effectively to try and unlock some of those issues, and how we can talk to people and try and I guess tease out of them what is creating the blockages for them to either adopt a new way of life or do something different. So that's, I think, what's alluding at. I think the thing that I took out of it, maybe because that's what that's what I've also been looking at, is this sort of notion of sufficiency. And it's a really difficult one to discuss, because when we talk about sustainability, we tend to think about things like, how can we make things more efficient, or, how do we use a piece of technology to make things better, really? But what we don't talk a lot about is what is sufficient for us to, what do we really need in our lives to be sufficient? And that's very difficult, because we all grow up in a consumerist lifestyle.
Sure.
We're bombarded with adverts, and everything around us is trying to say to us to buy this, buy that, and it's difficult to not buy into that, right? I mean, it's easy when Facebook flashes up at you and keeps telling you buy this great, jumper, and it, it's got you in the hills, and it makes you think, oh yeah, that's great, I should do that. And but I think yeah, it's difficult because, you know, trying to have a discussion about sufficiency with people tends to lead to, oh, but you want us to live in the Stone Age and stuff like that. And I think that's what the article's kind of alluding to, is that no, what we don't want to be doing is having that discussion. Like we don't want to send you back to the Stone Age, but what we want to have a discussion with you about is, you know, what is actually going to make you happier in life, what is going to give you a more fulfilled life, and do you really think, you know, buying all this extra stuff is going to make you happy? Like, and it's not, but we got to find a way of discussing it with you that allows you to think about it. And I think that's what the article is trying to, you know, what they're trying to get across in their research is that, how do we have discussions with people who have different views to allow us to sort of move forward?
And Mark, you summarized that beautifully. As you were going through, I was thinking, yeah, you've sort of hit all the key, I think, parts of the article, which is a fascinating article. And by the way, for listeners, we will link to the article that you can digest it yourselves. The thing you've mentioned it there, but it was, I think they were talking about sort of comfort, status, and control as being those kind of three key behavior sort of instigators, if you like, for us, for people, and how, as you mentioned, for example, with housing, which obviously aligns with a lot with what you do. I'm going to oversimplify things here, but we've obviously created a society in which the size of your house is literally a sort of an indicator of your status within a particular hierarchy, and there's value for you as an individual from a psychological perspective of therefore having a larger house, and ultimately that's an unsustainable outcome, because if we just have people wanting bigger and bigger houses, that's not going to allow us to realize some of the sustainability kind of outcomes that we want to achieve as a built environment. So would you mind just I want to kind of drag this, Mark, and sort of draw it towards your experience of working in sustainability within construction. Like, what role does, or when that was alluded to in the article, what did that make you sort of reflect on and think about?
I mean, for me, that sort of took me right back to what I think is something we don't talk about, which is this notion of lifestyle carbon. I think, at the moment, the industry is sort of moved on from energy efficiency now to embodied carbon. Mm-hmm. So that's all about the carbon that we're spending just building the stuff that we're doing right now. And obviously that is exceptionally important, right? We're building a lot of stuff out of concrete and high embodied carbon materials, and that's not great. But when we talk about this notion of, like you're saying, bigger and bigger houses, that's just using more and more stuff. Now, what we don't want to do is build micro flats for people. We've also seen that as a problem. But, we want to build houses that are comfortable and allow people to live healthy, comfortable lifestyles, right? The issue I have with this kind of notion of sort of bigger and bigger houses and this consumerist lifestyle is ultimately, in the UK, this is not really the case everywhere else. The desire is to this detached house, driveway with 2 cars in suburbia. And, that is comfortable for some people, but what that does is it leads you into very high carbon lifestyle. If you build all these houses in the countryside and everyone's got to drive to get to the shops, or they've, and all the deliveries that are coming there, and, the fact that, that their whole lifestyle is around the car, it's not that great, really. And, we don't really have all the answers, but I think the issue we really have in the UK is, and it comes out of good intentions, it comes from the fire at Grenfell, is that it's we're not allowed to put anything combustible on the outside of buildings, and it's very difficult to build anything, even on the inside, out of things like timber at a certain height. But we can do that at lower heights. So you're kind of incentivized to build low-rise housing. And, at the beginning, that low-rise housing probably does use less carbon. And, that's great. And we need to find ways of using bio-based materials in taller buildings. But as I say, again, if you just build, new towns, as Labour kind of wants to do it, where everyone's got to drive, I don't think it's going to take that long before that driving carbon is going to start overtaking everything else. And, we're sort of baking in a lifestyle which is just going to continue us to be consumerist, high carbon, really. Now, there's obviously a balance. What we don't want to do is build super tall, because that comes with its own problems. But yeah, that's I think that's a big thing we're trying to crack in the UK, really, is this. We have this idea of what a lifestyle should be. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, again, where I work now is in London. London's very different. London is a metropolitan city. It's got a public transport network, etc. People are sort of used to living without a car, although I'm still amazed at how many people drive in London. But I don't live in London. I live outside of London. I live very much in that kind of area. And, my neighbors have got 3 cars, and you just create this lifestyle where you can see you're just using more and more, you're driving more and more, really. So, yeah, I think that kind of hit a nail, hit a nerve in some respects for me, because I think, I'm not saying we know all the answers, but that is a difficult thing at the moment. A lot of the talks in sustainability in the construction industry and the examples that are used tend to be low-rise housing, and a lot of the time, houses that are sort of individual houses, really. And obviously, we need those examples. We need to use those smaller projects to try and test and innovate in new materials. But if Labour's serious and wants to build 1.5 million homes, if we build every house like that in those kind of areas, I think we're creating a bigger problem down the road, really. And I know that's kind of contentious, because the carbon we spend now is more important. Because that was always the argument with energy efficiency, is if I knock down this building and it's more efficient over its lifetime, that's better. And we kind of know that's not the case now. We need to be caring about how much carbon we're emitting now. But I think with this kind of lifestyle, I think we're gonna really realize just how much carbon is in our lifestyles. How we buy things, how we spend our money, how we get around. I think we're just going to find that, buildings do use a lot of energy, but actually we're using a lot in other areas.
And Mark, and by the way, that was brilliant. That was brilliant. I know for anyone that I love how you're being sympathetic to perhaps a non-expert built environment ear, which is helpful, certainly for myself as well. Let's talk about, because there's 2 things at play here. I think the article, to me, alludes to this quite nicely, in terms of you've got the individual, if you like, and the actions and decisions of the individual, and the impact of behavioral science, and creating essentially these new experiences for consumers and for homeowners, etc., can drive them towards making more sustainable choices. So that's fantastic. But there is still a need for the change in perhaps the perspective of the individual, in terms of what looks like a sort of desirable lifestyle, if you like. How do we address that? Is it, from a built environment perspective, is it purely and simply about education and getting people to understand, I know you want this, you've got this vision for what your ideal home would look like, but are you aware of the impact that therefore has? And is it as simple as that, or are there other things that we need to be doing in order to educate and to evolve that mindset?
I think it's really tricky, and I think this is an area we're going to see, hopefully see a lot of research in, because I think it's difficult. If we kind of knew what the solutions, we would be doing it right now. But I think, a lot of it is education. But I think it's almost, I worry about some of the education that, we're maybe teaching our children. I mean, I've got young children, so I'm kind of seeing it firsthand as to what they get told at school. And I'm kind of like, okay, this is interesting. And I think that's not helping. I've talked to you about this before, which is, I think sometimes we just take things at too face value. We're not critical enough about it. When I talk to a lot of my friends and family, I think like everyone cares. That's the point. We know that generally everyone cares, right? There's not often you come across a person who's just like, I don't care if we pollute that river kind of thing. But they don't they take what they get shown in the media as face value, basically. And that's tricky because it means that, when there is something that maybe is causing an issue, we're not really facing it. It's like the plastic versus paper argument. Now it's all about don't use plastic because we don't want to harm our oceans. But if you actually look back in history, in, I don't know which decades it was, but probably the 80s and 90s, everyone was saying use plastic because we don't want to chop down our forests, right? And actually what we should just be saying is, well, just don't buy the plastic or the paper bag, just use what you've already got. That's a behavioral thing, isn't it? And I think that's what's creating issues is that, people are going to the shops and they're seeing a piece of clothing that says made from recycled bottles and they're going, great. But no one's really going, yeah, but is that actually making a difference? And, is that like, where do those recycled bottles come from? And like, is it, clearing up? So I think that's tricky. I think so education, we do need to educate people more, but we've got to be careful about how we do it, I think. I'd rather people were more educated in how to think critically rather than just being told, it's bad to go and use a plastic bag, for example. Because I think we would learn a lot more from that. So yeah, I think it is that, but behavior is just, I think this is a tricky one. We've got an industry that wants to sell us a lifestyle, right? Which is about stuff and using stuff. And that's also a difficult one to track because, we are all influenced by that. I mean, I'm influenced by that. We all that's why people use marketing, right? Because it works. If it didn't work, we wouldn't do it. So I think it's difficult because we are sold this lifestyle where we've had car companies make us feel like driving is this, pleasurable, activity that is almost a hobby in some respects, when in actual fact, all you're doing is going from A to B, right? That's what you're there. That's what you're doing. And it's the same about, things like cycling and things like that. It's almost like we're trying to have arguments with each other. But actually, if we think about what our lifestyle and how how things can work, that can lead to some interesting discussions, really. I think so. If the cycling one's really interesting because if you speak to someone in probably even as late as the 50s and said, how did your milk get delivered? Well, it was on a bike. Okay. How did your mail get delivered? It was on a bike. How did your doctor come to visit you? It was on a bike, wasn't it? And that's, and people, and if you ask the people that kind of look back and they go, I quite like that. That's quite, they kind of, it's quite nice, isn't it? It's quite
nostalgic.
It's nostalgic, isn't it? Really. And so, if we had a discussion about that, rather than, well, you shouldn't drive because it's wrong, like that's, to try and tell people just to not do something is, I think it's quite, I don't think it achieves anything, really. I don't think you're going to change that person's opinion. You have to have a discussion with them and say, well, and if you cycled and you were a bit fitter, you might be a bit happier. Like, so what do you think about that? Does that change you?
And Mark, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, which is, I couldn't agree with you more. We need more positive reinforcement of the choices, the outcomes that are realized by the sustainable choices that can be made. And we need social media to reflect that. We need all of the influential kind of media-based engagements with people to highlight the value on a personal level of making these choices. What we also then need, and we've rattled through our time, but I'm really keen to get your take on this, especially in light of, the work that you do at Maccreanor Lavington. It's not just about individual actions, it's about systems change as well at a larger level. Can you just touch upon how within the built environment sector, how systems are evolving and changing broadly in terms of people's thinking about the sort of macro issues in order to enact or in order to encourage more sustainable outcomes at an individual level?
Yeah, I think there has been a good change in some aspects of it. Definitely the last 5 years, probably. We're getting things like the circular economy coming into our buildings. We're talking about embodied carbon. So I think there's definitely been some good progress there. But I think we're probably still struggling with the system as a whole, really. And that's what we haven't I think we do know this, but we haven't managed to implement yet. And, things like, why retrofit's so important. I think this is an interesting one. I think the construction industry kind of knows why retrofit's important, but it can't quite convince the government. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the retrofit argument has always been about energy efficiency at governmental level and reducing carbon, but actually probably the biggest benefit would be our health benefit. I think I don't like banding around statistics or numbers because you never or sometimes don't know how valid they are. But I think it's definitely in the top 5 reasons why people end up in hospital is because they come from poor housing. Mm-hmm. They have respiratory problems that come from living in damp or cold properties, and I think that's where that's a system that we need to look at, which is the direct impact from upgrading a building is it uses less energy, but actually there's all these other improvements and value that we get from doing that from people's health and happiness. And we haven't really been able to, we have quantified that in some respects, but we haven't been able to sort of sell that to, I think, to the government and general public, really, as to, we're not having those systematic discussions around health, so we've got this pot of money that goes to the NHS to treat people with respiratory illnesses, and we've got this pot of money over here to do energy efficiency. But actually, if we kind of joined them together and really thought about it, we probably would solve both issues much easier.
And equally, Mark, and that was so brilliantly alluded to, especially in light of the article talks about the interdisciplinary kind of collaborations and partnerships that are required, which you've just perfectly sort of highlighted. But again, coming back to the previous point that we were making about the individual and about the individual's view of a successful, happy, healthy lifestyle. Well, if we can draw these decisions back to my own personal health, and it's not that big, slightly ambiguous often for the individual in terms of carbon, energy efficiency, etc., but actually make it about the impact upon my prospective health. That's creating a totally different narrative for somebody to buy into the idea of a housing solution that is more sustainable in inherently as well. I hope I've made sense there. Just to conclude and reflect back on you, but perhaps you might comment on that.
No, I think you have. I mean, there have been some good, some successful projects that have been. I think they've taken models from generally a Scandinavian kind of communal housing model, and they've built that in the UK. And I think they have been very successful. They sort of these models that build a community effectively. So they're trying to get people to either self-build the houses or they have a much bigger say in what they do. But they're also designed in such a way that they try and recreate that community that I think, that's the bit that we've forgotten, I think, in some respects, is that how important that community is and how it makes a big impact on how we live our lives. And I think when people say it's going back to the Stone Ages, for me, it's not. It's going back to that lifestyle where we did live in a community. So you've got these developments where, you've got a communal kitchen and people take it in turns to cook, on a weekly basis, or there's like a tool shed where you could go and, rent, not even rent, just, borrow tools. And, the landscaping is designed to allow, people to grow food, or, children and people to congregate. And I think, once you get that, it's so much easier to do the other easier things about, upgrading buildings and stuff like that, I think.
And Mark, I think even drawing it back to this notion of, and again, the article alludes to this, the what makes us happy. I mean, we know, and again, I'm going to do what you did. I'm not going to suggest that I've got these stats directly off the top of my head, but you just look at the mental health crisis that we're in. You look at the amount of people that are feeling disconnected, they're feeling like they're not part of communities, the loneliness of our society. What you've just alluded to addresses all of those issues as well. So again, from what you've described today, it really is, and I know it's an obvious thing to say, but it really is that need for the sort of entwining of thinking across various different, well, if we make a decision in this area, what impact has that had upon X, Y, and Z? And let's not make decisions in isolation. Let's really bring, all of these different influences together to come up with a proper solution. But Mark, we're going to leave it there. Or no, we're not going to leave it there, because I still need to ask you the magic wand question. But I could carry on talking to you about this all day. I knew that it was going to be a show like this. But Mark, let me finish with the magic wand question. If we were to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the corporate commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
So because you've used the word corporate commercial rather than just something else, I'm going to say, and this is hopefully not too controversial, I would limit company size.
Interesting. Okay.
And it wasn't actually necessarily, this was not really my idea. It came from, chatting with friends and stuff like that. But I think we're seeing right now, and I don't want to get sued, so I don't know what I'm allowed to say, but, we're seeing what's happened now with a very rich billionaire and the influence they're having on things that they really shouldn't have. The power that they're coming from is a bit scary, actually. And I think, when you let things get too big, I mean, I don't want this to sound like some sort of like socialist argument. That's not what I'm coming from. But I think, once companies get too big, I think they get disconnected from the things that they're doing. And I think, I don't know how you would limit it. I don't know in what size you'd limit it, whatever. But I think you've got to think about, at some point, things are getting too big. I mean, I saw that with the engineering consultancies that I've worked at, the big ones. Are they engineering consultancies? In some respects, they're not. They're owned by investment banks. They're investments at the end of the day. They want to create value for their shareholders, so they've kind of become disconnected from that original small business, which is, I want to work on buildings and design buildings. And that's what's quite interesting around architecture practices, is there's not that many big ones, like massive, massive ones. And so I think there's something around size, or whatever that means, that I think it would be good to look at. And maybe I've changed my mind, maybe not cap it, but I think incentivize the small and medium. Because I think, again, if you're an employee that has got 50 employees, all their names, their history, you know about them, you care about them, and you're probably going to do a lot more to help them. Whereas if you have got 10,000 people in your organization, there's absolutely no way you know everyone, and you're disconnected from them. And I think you're disconnected from the work that they do.
Mark, I think I love it when we have a magic wand, use of our magic wand that no one's come up with before. No one has suggested that, which is brilliant, and certainly a food for thought. My immediate thinking goes to how much easier it is to retain purpose as a core driver within an organization that is smaller. You've alluded to it perfectly there. As soon as you start realizing who's actually owning this company, it becomes very clear what the intention and goal is for the organization, in terms of its ultimate outcome. Purpose, which obviously we need purpose-driven organizations to almost become the norm in order for us to address some of these challenges that we have in front of us. The smaller the organization, the easier it is to retain that purpose as a core fundamental. Marc, that's been an absolutely brilliant show. Obliterated our timeline, but hopefully our listeners have found it really interesting too, and will give us some leeway on a slightly longer episode. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great.
No, it's been great. Thank you very much, Charlie. It's been brilliant.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to Marc Seligmann, Head of Sustainability at Maccreanor Lavington, for joining us. Marc's expertise in energy efficiency and sustainable building design provided a thoughtful lens for exploring the themes in Dr. Cameron Brick's article on behavioral science and sustainability. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.